Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilashojitam Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shashvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payo Rasho Muda Kedato Vande Bhagavatani Mananudabam Mudna Nipatyakshito Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tvishe Namah Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamater Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Kudari Devatamor Madana Mohan Jar Sevak Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gopala Bhatta Dasa Raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Vandan Jaha Haite Vignanasha Bhishta Puran Krishna Dasa Kaviraja Rasika Bhaktamad Jai Rachido Caitanya-caritamrta Gaura Govinda Lila Shunite Gadai Shida Tahate Na Huido Morachita Jeva Nahi Bhujikeva Shunite Shunite Seha Kiad Bhuta Caitanya-carit Krishna Upajive Priti Janibera Serariti Shuni le borohoihit Shriyatam Shriyatam Nityam Giyatam Giyatam Mura Chintyatam Chintyatam Bhaktash Caitanya-caritamrta. So by the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana Prayojana Avatar Prema Purushottam Karuna Maha Sagar Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu and his beloved Parshad nourished by Shri Rup, Shri Sanatan, Raghunath, Shri Jiva and company, the exalted songs bird in the inexhaustible sky of Gaura Lila Srila Krishna Das, Kaviraja Goswami Pad. Again today we will continue our reading and discussion of Sri Caitanya-caritamrta. And we resume here in the Sanatana Shiksha, chapter 22, Madhya Lila. And today we start a new prakaran. For the last while we've been hearing a succession of verses and points made to support the conclusion that Krishna Bhakti is the principal abhideya taught in the Shastra. So now we take up the topic of how it is that a jiva in samsara comes to take up that abhideya of Krishna Bhakti. How does one go from, awash in the ocean of samsara, so to speak, to becoming a bhakta of Krishna and ultimately transcending samsara and reaching the lotus feet of Krishna. So, in one sense, this subject continues for the rest of the chapter, but for 12 or 13 verses specifically, the topic of how this transition into someone taking up the path is discussed. And then we get into what is the eligibility for the path, meaning Shraddha, what is the gradation in eligibility, the levels of adhikar for the path, and then we go into much further detail about the specifics of the path of sadhana bhakti. So that's sort of where we are on the track of the chapter, if you will. So I've shared the file in the box, should be available. And so I'm starting from verse 43. Sangsara brahmite kona bhagye kehotare nadira pravahe jeno kashta lagitire. While wandering in samsara, by some fortune, someone crosses over. Just as a piece of wood in the current of a river lands on the shore. So frequently samsara is compared to an ocean. So now we have an analogy of a similar situation, a piece of driftwood floating in a river, or it could be floating in the ocean. And how is it that a piece of driftwood lands on the shore? Something like that, a jiva lands at the feet of Bhagavan. So, what does this analogy imply? We'll dive into that in the coming discussion. So, the tippani states the following. Sometimes, by some sort of fortune, someone's taste for bhakti to him manifests. Thus he says, samsara, he speaks this verse. While wandering in samsara means in some birth in the course of one's beginningless transmigration. Crosses over means taste for bhakti, the existent means of crossing over samsara, manifests. So the rationale given in this comment is that since it has been established that Krishna Bhakti is the principle avideya, and that even mukti cannot be attained without it, the mention in the payar under discussion of someone crossing over samsara is to be understood to refer to someone attaining taste for bhakti, and then transcending samsara by performing bhakti impelled by taste for it. So, this following verse in the Bhagavatam that's cited will be the evidence for this statement in the payar. And who is this someone who crosses over? What is this cryptic or vague statement, some fortune that leads them to crossing over? That we'll understand from the commentaries on the coming verse in the Bhagavatam. So, a little bit of context. This next statement is a statement by Akrura. So it's spoken when he's on the way to Braja. He's coming from Mathura. He's been sent by Kamsa to bring Krishna from Mathura bring Krishna from Braja back to Mathura. And he has awareness, he has some shraddha in Krishna's divinity, and thus he considers that by the arrangement of destiny, he's playing this, he has this very interesting situation in which he was both bringing Krishna into this plot that's meant to kill him, and yet he's blessed with the awareness that it's impossible for this plan to ever succeed, and that he's actually on the way to meet Bhagavan himself. So in this peculiar situation of being so excited to finally have darshan of Bhagavan, while at the same time being implicated by circumstances into this task, which is not a task which is entirely an act of favorability towards him, knowing the intent that the person, the Prayojakarta, or the person organizing the task or causing the task to be performed, Kamsa, has no sort of favorability in mind, but yet nevertheless being fully confident in Krishna's divinity and capable to overcome such unfavorability in any case, Akrura is musing on his way to Vrindavan. So, this verse is spoken by him at that time. Maivam mama dhamasyapi syadeva chuta darshanam priyamana kalanadya kvachit tarati kaschana. Akrura muses, it is not like that. Although I am fallen, I may indeed attain the sight of Achyuta. Sometimes someone, being carried by the river of time, crosses over to the shore. So when he says it's not like that, it means no, it's not that even though I'm fallen or even though I have so many faults or this or that I'll never attain darshan of Achyuta. Regardless of my condition, it is possible. Sometimes someone crosses over this ocean of samsara, or in this river of time. Sometimes it happens. So what does he mean by this? Let's look at Jiva Gosvami's commentary to understand. So this is from the Laghu Vaishnav Toshini. He says, by virtue of his understanding and resolve, he says, Mayivam. So in other words, understanding that Krishna's grace and divinity is a far greater source of possibility and capability than even his own fallenness, and having conviction in that, he says Maivam, or he speaks this verse where he negates the doubt that he'll never have the fortune of seeing Krishna. By, quote, fallen, his feeling himself to be devoid of all the sadhanas required for attaining direct perception of him, and the opposite thereof, that is, and having performed numerous actions that are contrary to such sadhana, that is, offenses, is stated. So although I haven't done the necessary sadhana, and although I've committed aparad, still, sight of Achyuta, that is Sri Krishna, he who is free from any degradation by virtue of the greatness of his graciousness and so forth, even in response to only a semblance of worship of himself, may indeed occur on the strength of that greatness. And thus, Akrura says it is not like that, meaning, it is not that it is impossible for him to attain the sight of Krishna. The lin, that is the optative verbal form in the verb syat, is in the sense of possibility. So he's not saying it definitely will happen, he's not saying it is happening, he's saying it may happen, it's possible. There's the potential for it to happen. And where is that potential stored, so to speak? It's stored in Krishna. And so this comment that he just made is extracting significance out of the name chosen for Krishna here, Achyuta. So Achyuta means the one who is infallible, so to speak, or who never deviates or never goes away from what is, of their nature or of their ideal form, so to speak. So he's drawing out from that idea and saying, he who is free from any degradation, or he who is known as Achyuta, by virtue of the greatness of his graciousness and so forth. So why is he Achyuta? Because he has such profound graciousness. And elsewhere there's also a definition of the name Achyuta given as he whose bhaktas never fall, or whose bhaktas never suffer from degradation. So that's also implied here by saying that he's Achyuta because of this graciousness. And that graciousness is extended to people when they engage in even a semblance of worship of himself, or what he calls a bhajan abhas, or a bhaktya abhas. Not even a proper form of bhakti or a proper act of bhajan, but even a semblance of one is enough to evoke his grace and enough to lead to one ultimately attaining darshan of him. So, Jiva Gosvami explains further, he thinks of an illustration in this regard. Even when transmigrating in the flow of time and the experience of various karmas, sometimes, when a cause, such as speaking the name of Sri Bhagavan as a designation, that is, an instance of namabhas occurs, some, like Ajamil and others, cross over, that is, they attain Sri Bhagavan, who is like the bank thereof, that is, of the river of samsara. Alternately, when somehow going near him and the like occurs, someone like Putana and others also crosses over, that is, attains Bhagavan. So Putana, she came to kill Krishna, but in the course of doing so, she did also affectionately nurse him like a loving mother, and she did also dress excellently like a gopi. So Krishna appreciated that. He appreciated how well she mimicked the affectionate behavior and appearance of a gopi, and decided to bless her for that act of, that act which caused satisfaction to him, despite the fact that she did it as a ploy to kill him. So, similarly, Ajamil, he called out the name of his son, which happened to be a name of Bhagavan. So these are both examples Jiva Gosvami is giving of what he called a bhajan abhas, or a semblance of an act of bhajan. It's not really an act of bhajan, because the person wasn't trying to serve Krishna. Nevertheless, they ended up doing something that was pleasing to him, or doing something that results in some honor being shown to him. And therefore, Krishna is of such graciousness that he even blesses people who do that. If somehow anybody, even unintentionally or even with an ill intention, somehow does things that are satisfying to him or that somehow show honor to him or honor some aspect of him, then he's ready to favor them just for that. He's this generous. It is suggested by the metaphor of the river that as a blade of grass or otherwise being carried therein crosses over when a cause of favorability. So this is a little bit of a play on words, because the word, what we often call in English favorability, anukulya or anukul, originally comes from the word kul, means the bank of a river. So anukul means towards the bank. So like a breeze would be called anukul or favorable when it's blowing you in towards the shore. It's helping you get to your destination. So when things would lead one towards one's goal or lead one towards the shore, then they were called anukul, and perhaps by conventional usage, the word became, broadly used as an abstract concept, independent of the idea of literally reaching a shore. So here he's using that idea that when something is, quote, anukul, or leads one towards the shore, then a piece of grass or something being carried in the river reaches the shore. Similarly, a jiva being carried along in the river of samsara reaches the bank when a favorable force leads them towards the bank. So one point I'd like to comment on this, which I didn't include in the text here, but for the philosophically inclined, it may be of interest, is that many things in the Laghu Vaishnava Toshani are clearly built from the Brihad Vaishnava Toshani of Sanatana Gosvami. And we know that Jiva Gosvami wrote after Sanatana Gosvami and more or less edited his commentary, or in some cases added content, in some cases removed content, and presented things as he saw fit. And generally we understand that Jiva Gosvami was given the right to do that, or, as the star pupil of Rupa Gosvami, as the beloved nephew and dearest student of both Rupa and Sanatan, he had the adhikar, as we call it, to edit even the works of Rupa and Sanatan. So, looking at the Brihad Vaishnava Toshani on this verse, in my humble opinion, there definitely does seem to be an indication of a philosophical edit having been made. And the reason I say that is with reference to statements that are also found in the Brihad Bhagavatamrita, which I had, just for another reason, happened to be looking at recently. Someone was asking me about them. And there's a case there in the Brihad Bhagavatamrita where Bhagavan is described as having unconditional grace for his bhakta, and such that he feels unrest or he feels anxiousness even about not what's mentioned as not a bhakta but a jiva in samsara who's never performed any type of bhakti abhas. And it describes Bhagavan as breaking his age-old rule of intervening in the life of a jiva in samsara and appearing as that jiva's guru and causing that jiva to be born in Braja such that that jiva could achieve bhakti and come back to him. And Sanatana Gosvami describes it as that the rule, so to speak, is Bhagavan won't intervene or won't take action in relation to a jiva's life if the jiva hasn't come in contact with the sadhu, if the jiva hasn't come in contact with a bhakti abhas, if the jiva hasn't somehow been touched by Bhagavan's own shakti, then there's nothing that can attract or pull Bhagavan towards that jiva, so to speak, as was discussed by Jiva Gosvami in the Paramatma Sandarbha. So we see this point where Sanatana Gosvami specifically says, in the absence of any type of sadhu sangha and in the absence of any type of bhakti abhas, Bhagavan decided to grace this jiva by causing them to be born in Govardhan and becoming their guru. And in his commentary, the Brihad Vaishnava Toshni, on this verse that we're talking about now, he uses very similar language to the point that I'm referring to in the Brihad Bhagavatamrita, and describes how this, sometimes someone crosses over the river. He says, why does it happen? It happens by the unconditional grace of Bhagavan intervening in the life of that jiva awash in samsara. And he uses the exact same language that he uses in the Brihad Bhagavatamrita when he's talking about the same topic. So what's interesting is that if you read the Laghu Vaishnava Toshni after that, you can see that where Sanatana Gosvami wrote Nirupadika Kripa, or this unconditional grace came upon that jiva, then Jiva Gosvami comes in, deletes Nirupadi Kripa, and says, in the presence of a bhaktya bhas, or bhajana bhas rather, Bhagavan gives his grace. So, Jiva Goswami's interpretation of this statement is directly opposite to the same subject as is discussed in the Brihad Bhagavatamrita. Now, I don't want to fry anybody's circuits if anyone's uncomfortable with pointing out areas where there might be some philosophical subtle difference between the viewpoints, even amongst our beloved Goswamis. But this appears to be the case, in my personal humble opinion. And the reason we say that is because we see in the Paramatma Sandarbha, as was discussed at length for those who participated in Babaji Maharaj's courses on those texts, that for Jiva Goswami, it's impossible for Bhagavan to intervene in the life of a jiva simply based on seeing the jiva's condition in samsara. Because Bhagavan himself is constituted of Sarup Shakti, he has no experience of the suffering under the influence of the Maya Shakti, and Jiva Goswami defines grace as something that arises only when the heart is pricked or the heart is touched by observing the suffering in another that oneself knows to be suffering or that oneself has experienced. Because Bhagavan never has and never will experiencing the suffering that a jiva does in samsara, because Bhagavan will never be in ignorance, Bhagavan will never be subject to his own maya, Bhagavan can never actually be directly compassionate for a jiva's suffering because he doesn't have any experience of that. That is not a fault in Bhagavan, because there's no fault in the sun for not having any darkness in it. There's no fault in a wise person for not being ignorant. There's no fault in someone who's infinitely blissful for not being blissful. So it's not a detriment or something, a shortcoming on Bhagavan's part that he has this quote-unquote absence. Rather, it's a merit, or it's his supreme glory. This is all, for those who are familiar, elaborated on in Paramatma Sandarbha and touched on a little bit in Bhakti Sandarbha. So we see that in the Sandarbhas, Jiva Goswami has done specific detailed philosophical analysis on this point to establish this conclusion. And therefore, it appears to me, again, and this is just my 2 cents, that Jiva Goswami may have intentionally refined or tied up a loose end a little bit in some of what Sanatana Goswami Pad has written. And another reason for this would be the statements in the second section of the Vedanta Sutra, where it explains the problem with the idea of Bhagavan acting out of unconditional grace upon the suffering of some jiva. The philosophical problem with that, if you will, is that it creates what's philosophically considered a fault of Vaishamya, or partiality in Bhagavan. Because if he then intervened in the life of one jiva without any quote-unquote due cause, in other words, without there being the prayer on behalf of that jiva from a bhakta, or there not some other way being some element of the Sarup Shakti involved in the destiny of that jiva, then why would he intervene in the life of one and not the other? And as Jiva Goswami says elsewhere, in that same section I'm referring to, if Bhagavan had direct experience of the jiva's suffering in samsara, he would feel compassion for them, he would be compelled to end their suffering, and therefore there would be no samsara, there would be no, an infinity of jivas beginninglessly undergoing the suffering of samsara, because Bhagavan wouldn't allow it. So, because of, you could say, the problem of the world needing to exist, or another, the difficulty of philosophy, you have to explain the fact that this world does exist, unfortunately. And also you have to deal with, how you can show Bhagavan to be profoundly compassionate and at the same time not subject to the fault of partiality. So this is how Jiva Gosvami has balanced all of these elements. So I've only included Jiva Goswami's commentary here. I haven't gone into all of that. I felt like it was a little bit of excessive detail and not directly relevant to presenting the Tatparya of the Caritamrta. But verbally, I'm just throwing this out for, as I said, for the philosophically inclined who might like to analyze such matters. In any case, I'll come back to what we're discussing now specifically, which is this idea of how it is that this jiva gets carried towards the shore. What is that force that's now the current that's pulling that jiva that's in the cycle of its own karma towards the shore, towards the feet of Bhagavan? So, in the view of Jiva Gosvami, it is the performance or the condition of having committed or performed, committed like it's a fault, having done some type of bhakti abhas. So this is the first level of understanding. We'll get to the role of sadhu sangha shortly, but thus far, none of the tikas on this particular verse mention sadhu sangha specifically, and because this verse is cited as evidence for the previous payar, we won't specifically mention sadhu sangha as the, quote, fortune that leads the jiva to samsara, even though that's mentioned just ahead. So don't worry if you're eager to hear some sadhu sangha mahatmya, it's coming soon. But we should also understand the importance of this idea of bhakti abhas and how that can also happen unintentionally to someone, whether they know it or not. And that's also, so to speak, a way by which, destiny or, a spiritual destiny, I should say, comes upon some jiva within samsara. Okay, so I've got a little discussion on these points. From this commentary, it can be understood that just as a piece of wood awash in a river has no ability of its own to reach the shore, so a jiva wandering in samsara has no ability to deliver themselves from samsara, that is, to reach Sri Bhagavan, who has been compared to the shore of the river. As a piece of wood only reaches a river's shore when a particular current in the river carries it to the shore, so only when a jiva is brought into connection with Sri Bhagavan by a force outside of itself does the jiva cross over the river of samsara and reach Bhagavan. So the first point, why is this whole piece of wood awash in a river analogy being used? You might say, a jiva is a conscious being. A piece of driftwood is an unconscious being. Why are you comparing a conscious being to an unconscious being? This is an unfair analogy. So, as we all know, all analogies are only partial, or, two things that are being compared to each other never have 100% identical characteristics, otherwise they would be the same object. So as soon as you compare anything, there has to also be some difference which is not implied in the comparison. So it's okay to compare a conscious entity to a non-conscious entity, because the point here is not about consciousness. The point is about illustrating the fact that there needs to be a force outside of oneself that enables this object, whether it's conscious or unconscious, to reach a particular destination. As a piece of wood only reaches a river's shore when a particular current in the river carries it to the shore, so only when a jiva is brought in connection with Bhagavan by a force outside of itself does the jiva cross over the river of samsara and reach Bhagavan. What constitutes such a force that can lead a jiva beyond samsara to the feet of Bhagavan? As per the aforecited commentary, it is the act of even unintentionally performing some form of bhakti abhas, that is, some semblance of an act of bhakti, just as Ajamil called out the name of Bhagavan for the purpose of calling his son, and Putana personally nursed Bhagavan after having beautifully adorned herself like a gopi, albeit with the intent of killing him. Another famous example is that in connection with Shivratri of the hunter who spent all night crying in a bael tree in the dark and picking leaves off the tree to distract his, restless mind as he spent the night hungry in the tree. And little did he know that he happened to do that on Shivratri, and he happened to be above a Shivlingam, and the tears from his eyes happened to bathe the Shivlingam, and all the leaves he picked out of, fidgeting with a restless mind happened to fall on the Shiv Thakur, and thus he ended up doing an all-night Abhishek to Bhagavan Shiv with his own tears and bael leaves on Shivratri, and therefore got major grace from Shiv Thakur, even though he had no intention to do any of that whatsoever. So in this way, you have another example of a bhakti abhas, or it was an act of bhakti, but it wasn't insofar as the person didn't know that they were doing it or even trying to do it. They just happened to do it. Thus, the fortune or bhagya mentioned in the previous payar can be understood to refer to a jiva somehow performing some form of bhakti abhas, which evokes Sri Bhagavan's grace upon a jiva. In the ensuing verses, further understanding of the fortune that leads to the jiva's deliverance from samsara is given, and the additional steps that take place in the process of a jiva's ultimately reaching Sri Bhagavan are explained. So this analogy, the piece of wood washes up on the shore, sort of like 0 to 100. So there's many stages in the middle. So now we'll get into, the rest of the chapter, so to speak. We'll go into all the nitty, and even the next chapter, we'll go into all the intermediate elements that take place along the way. Kono bhagye karo samsara kshayan mukohai saru sange tabe krishne rati upajai. By some fortune, someone's samsara reaches the verge of cessation, and then, as a result of association with a sadhu, inclination for Krishna manifests. The tippani states the following. He describes the progression in the manifestation of taste for bhakti. He speaks this verse. By some fortune, when the time of cessation of someone's samsara shall be reached, then association with the bhakta of Bhagavan will come about, and then taste for Krishna bhakti manifests. So there's one little bit tricky feature of this verse. It's perhaps slightly technical, but for anyone interested in that, I'll explain it. And that is the use of the word rati in this verse. So I've given the following discussion in this regard. In the tippani on the previous verse, crossing over samsara was equated with acquiring taste or ruchi for Bhagavad Bhakti. And in the present payar, the cause of acquiring such taste is explained to be association with the sadhu, that is a bhakta of Sri Bhagavan. One may wonder why the tippani refers to the word rati in the payar under discussion as taste, ruchi, and why it has been translated above as inclination, when the word rati is explained later in this chapter to be a term for the sprout of priti, that is, the initial state of directly manifest prema for Krishna, which is also known as bhava, bhava bhakti, and sthayi bhava. The reason for this is found in the Laghu Vaishnav Toshani commentary of Jiva Gosvami on the verse from Srimad Bhagavatam cited next as evidence for the present payar. In the version of this verse cited here in Caitanya-caritamrta, the final word of the verse is rati, and thus it is clear that the mention of the word rati in the payar under discussion is drawn from this mention of rati in the evidential verse from Srimad Bhagavatam. Sri Jiva explains in his commentary, however, that he finds the word mati, that is inclination, to be the primary reading of the verse, and that the word rati, and the word rati to be a variant. Moreover, even in the case of the reading of rati, he considers the word to refer only to, that needs an a sprout that is a slight initial manifestation of the rati that is defined later in this chapter as the sprout of priti and also as bhava, bhava bhakti, and sthayi bhava. So, quote, attachment is also a variant of inclination. Thus it can be understood that inclination, the nature of which is the sprout of rati, in the technically defined sense of the initial stage of directly manifest prema, specifically manifests as a result of association with the sat, only when they are capable. That is, only when the sat whose association one attains are capable of manifesting it. So in other words, if you look in most editions of the Bhagavatam that you can find, in the verse that we'll discuss in a minute from the Bhagavatam, the last word of the verse is rati. Is not rati, is mati. But, as you'll see in the Caritamrta, not a lot, but in some cases, the variant or the specific readings of the Bhagavatam that are quoted in the Caritamrta differ from the most common or prominent readings of the Bhagavatam that you find today and in various other editions of the Bhagavatam. So, from Jiva Gosvami's commentary, we can understand that Jiva Gosvami's edition of the Bhagavatam had the word mati. But for whatever reason, Kaviraja Goswami, when he's quoting this verse of the Bhagavatam here, he's got it with the word rati. And when he's writing this payar, which is obviously a statement to summarize the content of this verse in the Bhagavatam, he's putting the word rati into his payar. However, we see that Jiva Gosvami has commented that he prefers the reading mati, and that even if the reading is rati, he interprets the word rati not to mean rati in the technical sense as given in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, but rather in a generalized sense which is equivalent in meaning to mati. So if we read the Caritamrta in light of Jiva Goswami's analysis, we will take it that the word rati here doesn't mean rati in the technical sense, it means rati in the general sense of mati. And that therefore explains why the tippani speaks of the content of this verse as referring to ruchi rather than specifically to rati. So, being a not highly intelligent person, you might guess how long it took me of analyzing all these things to piece this together. I hope it sounds simple, but this was a brain racker for quite a while, and I had to go through quite a number of commentaries to get all this to make sense. So I hope this is just like a quick spoon feed that sounds nice and simple to resolve something that otherwise is a bit of a head scratcher. And I've got more evidence, just in case anyone's still in doubt. Another reason that the word rati is in the present payar and the verse from Srimad Bhagavatam cited hereafter is best understood to mean mati, is that taste, that is that the discussion I'm reading too fast. The discussion that follows these verses here in Caitanya-caritamrta next describes how a fortunate jiva receives instruction and acquires shraddha, which are the next steps in the progression of the jiva towards the accomplishment stages of the path of bhakti, of rati and prema, that is bhava bhakti and prema bhakti. If the word rati were taken to refer to bhava bhakti, it would create a break in the natural order of the sequence in the explanation of the progression of stages in which a jiva crosses over samsara and reaches Bhagavan. In other words, we have, conceptual evidence from the commentary, but also by, natural analysis. If this is describing the stages that are happening, why would you say, okay, here's stage 1, and then by sadhu sangha they get, stage 9 out of 10. And now again, let's talk about how they get back to stage 2. Right? It would be quite strange. Whereas when you understand it to be mati, you're talking about something that's preliminary to shraddha, which would then create a flow in the explanation of, guess what? Stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and it goes in a perfect order that way. So by reference to the progression of thought within the prakaran, you also have, hermeneutic leverage, so to speak, to take this interpretation. And to support that, I've got a reference from the commentary on the Bhakti-rasamrita Sindhu. It should also be understood here that the word ruchi, as it is being used in the tippani, does not refer to the stage in the self-manifestation of prema that follows nishta and precedes asakti, as will be discussed ahead in the next chapter. Rather, it refers to a general notion of taste that precedes and is fundamental to the acquisition of shraddha, as Sri Rupa explains in Bhakti-rasamrita Sindhu at the end of the first chapter, where he says, quote, even just a little taste shall be an illuminator of the nature of bhakti. So Jiva Goswami's comment on this statement is quite nice. This is an important point. He says, taste or ruchi here means a sense based on a prior samskara of excellence in regard to Srimad Bhagavatam and so forth. That is, in regard to texts constituted of words explicative of the nature of bhakti, i.e., a sense that expressions which describe bhakti refer to something which is most excellent, meaning more valuable and relishable than all else. That alone, so this is the kicker, that alone, meaning this taste, illuminates the nature of bhakti, that alone causes the attainment of shraddha, as per the word, that is, shraddha in bhakti as per the way it's defined in the Shastra. So this is, you could say, going into the analysis of the dynamics in the psyche that are fundamental even to the emergence of shraddha. So what does someone have, quote, faith or conviction in? They have something that seems good, to put it really simple. In other words, you don't put your faith in something that obviously looks dumb, bad, faulty, problematic, and unreliable. You acquire conviction, you acquire faith, you hold on to something, or you, quote, hold true, as the word shraddha can be taken etymologically, something that gives the impression of being of excellent nature, of being meritorious, of being held to be such. So to hold conviction in something or to have faith in something, fundamental to that is to have recognition of its, here the word is uttamatva, the excellence of that thing, that it's a quality thing. So he describes that sense of something being excellent or having such a meritorious nature that it's worth holding on to or attributing value to. He calls that taste. So by hearing these things, when the impression of hearing these things, from hearing these things, when the impression arises, that was good, or that was nice, or that's excellent, then, from that sense of the excellence emerges the conviction in the thing. Just as, people have a plan. How should we solve this problem? Okay, here's our plan. Okay, sounds good. I follow. I'll help you. Or, I'll put this, plan into action. These are the conceptual steps in the unfolding of going from, zero acquaintance to holding something in conviction in it and then acting upon it. So, to take up the path of bhakti, one has to have shraddha, conviction in that, as we'll definitely discuss at length in the coming, verses in this chapter. But here, more fundamentally to that, one first of all has to have the sense that this is something that's worthy of such, that is possessed of excellence. And so to have the taste or the sense of its goodness, to be able to sense that it is of value, that's called taste, or a sensibility to perceive such. So from that sense of it being valuable will come the conviction in it, from the conviction will come the application of it, and then from the application of it will come the experience of its effect. So ultimately one will, quote, reach the shore, as if we go back to the initial tippani that we're discussing, you'll reach the shore by the engagement in bhakti, and you'll take up engagement in bhakti when you acquire, quote, taste or a sense of its value. So this is the whole point that's trying to be explained using this metaphor of a piece of wood and all of that, is that when in the mess of the world, or the flow of transmigration of samsara, whatever you want to call it, somehow or another, when you end up in the company of a sadhu and you hear about the Bhagavatam, you hear about the Shastra, you hear about bhakti from that sadhu, and then when you have a sense that this is something excellent, this is something worthy of holding conviction in and applying in your life, then by that association you acquire this taste for the thing, and then come the conviction, the practice, and the attainment, etc. So this is the whole point that's trying to be taught. So now we'll come to the verse in the Bhagavatam that this is based on. Bhavapavargo brahmato yada bhavet janasya tarhya chuta satsamagama satsangamo yarhita daiva sadgato paravarishe tvai jayati rati. When the sensation of worldly existence shall come about for a wandering person, then, O Achyuta, association with the Sat shall come about. And when association with the Sat shall come about, only then does inclination manifest towards you, who are the shelter of the Sat, or interpreted another way, whose shelter is the Sat, and the master of the higher and lower. So Jiva Gosvami has some extended commentary on this verse, which is very nice, and I think worthy of discussion, because it elucidates very clearly the progression of thought that's trying to be brought out here in the Caritamrta. So we'll dive into this. And also, I can just say from a learner's perspective that when initially seeing this payar that we just discussed a minute ago, where it describes someone reaching someone's samsara coming to the verge of cessation, or coming near its end, and then getting sadhu sangha, and how this point is also said, is literally what is said in the verse, that when your worldly existence nears its end, then you get sadhu sangha. I always remember scratching my head going, then what is the cause of that? It seems like sadhu sangha would be the cause of someone's situation in samsara starting to end. But it's saying that something causes your worldly existence to start to end, and then you get sadhu sangha. So what is that cause of the thing that seems like it would be the cause? I always remember hearing this again and again and going this doesn't make sense, it seems backwards. But not being able to, find any source of explanation that, explain the point. So lo and behold, as soon as you can actually just read what Jiva Gosvami says, it becomes clear as day, and he explains this exact point with two different interpretations. Quote, when the cessation of worldly existence shall come about for a wandering person, then when the sensation of worldly existence, so here's the first interpretation. Quote, when this existence will come to an end, what does that mean? When the cessation of worldly existence is thought well of by the all-knowing. Which is a bit of a cryptic way of saying, that when the all-knowing, or when those who are wise deem it to be fit, or when Bhagavan's, so wills, it may be considered that then someone comes to have sadhu sangha. This is a general way it can be understood. But his second interpretation is clearly the interpretation he favors, and gives more discussion of. Alternately, the fourth type of the ornament known as hyperbole, or atishayokti, is described as follows in a gloss thereof. Quote, that which is a prior statement of an effect, i.e. a statement of an effect preceding mention of its cause, to express the swift effectiveness of the cause in producing the effect, is the fourth type of hyperbole. Accordingly, so in other words, if you apply this hermeneutic to this verse, then the meaning becomes the opposite. The meaning is that when association with the Sat shall come about, then the cessation of worldly existence shall verily come about swiftly. So, in other words, all it's trying to say is that association with sadhus brings about the termination of your life in samsara, but the order is reversed as if it's saying the opposite. not for the sake of actually conveying the opposite, for the sake of saying that it happens so swiftly, or it's such a powerful cause, that it's as if the other way around. So since the association of the Sat, that is, the reason association with the Sat swiftly leads to the cessation of worldly existence, is stated in the second half of the verse. Since when inclination towards you also becomes manifest, the cessation of worldly existence shall also come about. That is, it is inclination towards Bhagavan that is the primary cause of the cessation of worldly existence. And since this swiftly arises as a result of sadhu sangha, and only as a result of sadhu sangha, it is said that sadhu sangha is a swiftly effective cause of the cessation of worldly existence. And there will be more on this exact point a little bit later, so I won't elaborate on that, but there's one point to make in this regard. Thus, he also says, quote, tada eva, only then. That is, sadhu sangha is the only cause of inclination towards Sri Bhagavan becoming manifest. On account of the word only, eva, the meaning is never at any other time. That is, inclination towards Bhagavan does not become manifest at any time by any other means than the association of the Sat. The purport of calling out to Bhagavan O Achyuta is that you too are unfailing in that regard. That is, you never act in a manner that leads to circumstances that contradict the aforementioned conclusions. So I'll just add here that what's also significant is that he says that it's the acquisition of inclination towards Bhagavan that is the principal cause of the cessation of worldly existence. So what does that mean? It means that what prolongs your condition of being in the world is the state of your mind. And that when you have the inclination towards something outside the world, then the time of your retention in this world starts to shorten. And so long as that inclination has not entered your mind, you're not getting out of here anytime soon. So this point he makes explicitly later in a commentary that I'll cite at the end of this discussion. But what it underscores is what the universal principle, what they call tat kratu nyaya, which he explains in the Priti Sandarbha, or what you might call the principle of specific intention. Whatever you intend, that's ultimately how you act. How you act shapes ultimately the circumstances that you meet, and that ultimately shapes the destiny and the experience that you have. So, as per the intention that you set, as per the inclination that you foster, in short speak, as per the predominant vasana in your psyche, that's the physical environment that you ultimately live in. Your present physical environment is the outcome of the state of your own psyche at some point in your previous trajectory. So, as far as persons pursuing not only spiritual things, but even material things, how you attune what you make or what gradually becomes as a result of how you think and act on a daily basis, the predominant vasana within your psyche, that will literally manifest the environment in which you live sooner or later. So, to turn that environment, so to speak, into Bhagavan's Dham, or to make one's future environment the environment that is Bhagavan's, is to thus require desiring that alone, or to have the bhakti vasana, to have one's vasana for bhakti become the principal vasana within one's psyche. This is the all-important thing. This is the purpose of every form of sadhana. And what sadhu sangha does is create the samskara for that vasana. So as we'll get to later on, but just I'll emphasize it again because it's an important point. When Rupa Gosvami speaks about fortune or bhagya, he defines it as Mahat Sangari Samskara Vishesh, or the samskara created by the association with a great bhakta. That is the fortune, so to speak. So all of these things, any type of external practice, any type of physical activity related to bhakti, all of it, the value of it fundamentally is principally in the conditioning effect that it has upon the psyche. And it's when the mind reaches that state of aikantikata, or one-pointedness upon Bhagavan, such that one's desire is for Bhagavan and not for anything else, one's desire is for bhakti, satisfying Bhagavan and nothing else, that one then reaches the state of rati. That's precisely how rati is defined. Tadeka sprihatvam eva. That desirousness solely of him is the principal characteristic of rati. That itself is bhava. That itself leads to the experience of prem. That itself evokes Bhagavan's grace. That itself compels Bhagavan to, reciprocate with one's wishes, etc., etc. So, all of these points fundamentally boil down to, or this whole unfolding begins with this mati, or this inclination, or this ruchi, taste, that emerges from this exposure, emerges from principally by association through hearing of a sadhu about Bhagavan, bhakti, etc. So this is, in a nutshell, the whole process that's being described. This commentary goes on for quite a while, so I think I'll leave it at that for today, and we'll finish this point and others related to it in the next class. So before I go over time, I'll pause here. If anyone has comments, questions, corrections, feedback of any other type, please feel free to share. Yes.
This is Brett. So we were discussing this in Sridhara class, but let's be more specific. If Krishna really is totally absorbed in, his own swarup and is not really aware of what's going on here, how do we explain Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's advent?
Why do we have any difficulty explaining it?
Well, because Lord Chaitanya is specifically very munificent and goes out of his way to give mercy to the conditioned souls, whereas Jiva Gosvami seems to say that Bhagavan really is not aware and is not concerned all that much.
Okay, well, as per the view of the Caitanya-caritamrta, what Kaviraja Goswami calls the mool prayojan, or the principal purpose, the principal aim that Krishna has for his avatar as Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, is threefold, and he refers to a verse of Sri Rupa Gosvami, Radha Pranaya Mohima Kidrisha Va Yanaiva. He appears to adopt Radharani's bhav, to recognize the greatness of her prem, to experience the bliss that she experiences, to perceive the madhurya in him that only her bhav can enable one to experience the joy produced by that experience of his own madhurya that only her bhav can give, etc. You're well acquainted with these things. This is the principal purpose of the avatar. So Mahaprabhu can appear for that reason. There's no need for him having another reason. And this whole narrative about him being, blessing the jivas and all of this can be considered what you call anushangik, or an ancillary integrated purpose that he accepts in the course of fulfilling his primary purpose. These are points discussed in the 3rd and 4th chapters of the Adi Lila. And there, we can say that because he's adopted the bhav of a bhakta, and because he's in the association of bhaktas, because he's also wishing to fulfill the wishes of bhaktas, he can also perform this lila of generously, widely bestowing grace upon jivas. It doesn't require him to have the exact experience that jivas have in this case in order to be gracious towards them.
All right, that's a very good explanation. So it's incidental to his own experience. He's coming here to experience something completely internal, and by the way, we also get to see that and experience something.
Yeah, it works out good, huh?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yes,
I
Aditya?
have a quick question. The tippani, who is it by?
This is the text attributed to Visvanatha Cakravarti Pad.
Oh, okay. But we're not sure.
It's not determined. I personally am not fully convinced that it's really his work. But it does have many nice points. And I kept again and again saying, in the commentary attributed to Vishnatha, I just got tired of saying that and writing that so many times. So I just realized I'll just call it tippani and then explain in the introduction the whole story behind it, and then not have to say that in every single purport, you know. So that's why it's like that. Yes, I see another hand.
Yeah, Maharaj. Is it okay to ask a question from the last couple of classes, like what we were talking about?
Sure.
So, regarding this point about the reorientation of the desires of the bhakta who worships Krishna with, you know, material desires, but eventually those desires then orient for like bhakti ras. The question that I have is, you know, I was reading Cakravarti Pad's commentary on the 12th shloka of the 4th chapter, the one where it says people seeking the fruits of their actions worship the devas. And so Cakravarti Pad basically in that commentary talks about how people who are full of desires, they actually, I can just read the little snippet. It says, Mama sakshat bhutam api bhakti margam parihaya shigra phala sadhakam karma vartam eva anuvartanta. So that they actually will abandon this path of bhakti and worship, go back to karma. So my question is, given that these people did engage in some bhakti over time, but then abandoned it for karma to get their material desires fulfilled, will there be some other time in the future that they'll perhaps come back?
It's possible. I mean, in other words, that it's guaranteed, we couldn't necessarily say. It would also depend on their behavior and, you know, the yadrichya flow of, you know, the attention of sadhus, because maybe the person would happen to get sadhu sangha again for whatever reason. Then, you know, it might happen quickly, maybe not, maybe later. Maybe some latent samskar will get activated by something in a future life, maybe not. So it's possible, but to say that it's definite might be, you know, might be hard to say 100% for certainty, but there's a possibility. All right, well, let's leave it at that for today. And if we're so blessed, we'll continue next week, and we'll hear more about the meaning of this verse, as well as another verse I've got from Akrura, which talks about the similar theme, and some commentary on that. So I conclude here. Vaishnavebhyo namo namah. Jai Shri Guru.
Excuse me,
Jai Shri
Prabhu. Hare
Guru.
Krishna. Haribo Prabhu. Excuse me. Last minute. I would like to know where can we have the retransmission of your session, in which site and or which page we can find your session.
Session means?
I mean this Zoom, this actual Zoom. Every time you make a session of Zoom, I would like to listen again, but I don't know where to go to have
Okay.
it.
There's a Google Drive file which has recordings of these discussions, so you can have a look at that, and you'll find all the recordings there.
Yes, but where I can find the link?
I think it's on the Jiva website, on the class page on the Jiva
On your
website.
website. Under your name, your specific name, maybe.
Yeah, there's a page that lists the classes that are happening at the Jiva Institute, and there's a page for this class, and I think the link is there to the recordings of these.
Okay, very nice. Okay, thank you. Excuse me for the inconvenience. Thank you very much.
All right. Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam. Haribol.